Hi, everybody. I'd like to introduce Ramaswami from Princeton, who works in the intersection of sustainability and house meet, where it meets the urban design. Well, welcome, Anu.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me here. And I thought I would just give you an overview of my lab and some of the new things we're doing with the idea of thinking how we might connect or talk about potential collaborations in the future. So my topic is towards zero carbon cities with health, climate resilience, and equity co-benefits. And I'm actually drawing upon a review paper that's going to come out next month in the annual reviews of ARER, Energy and Resources. I want to really acknowledge my lab, the Urban Nexus Lab at Princeton University, the NSF-supported Sustainable Healthy Cities Network, and all of my colleagues at different parts of campus, including the Chadda Center for Global India, where I'm the faculty director. So if you move to the next slide, I've organized my talk in terms of 5 broad topics. I'll give you a very brief introduction to my lab. I'll then talk about this urban system science. Is there a framework for connecting decarbonization with health, resilience, equity? What's a framework? I know a lot of people ask me, what are your models? And this is a higher level than that. What's the framework to bring models together? And then we'll zoom in on zero carbon pathways in a paper that's currently in review, so I won't be able to share as much. And then we'll talk about some insights, and then how do we scale up, which is where I'm really keen to think about collaborations. So the next slide is really quickly about my lab. Our mission is to develop sustainable, healthy, and equitable cities through a focus on integrated multi-sector urban innovations, infrastructure innovations, and through knowledge co-production with cities. And particularly, we want to advance the science of sustainable urban systems through interdisciplinary collaborations and advances in data science. And the next slide shows, broadly speaking, we focus on key provisioning systems, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but these are buildings, energy, food, green infrastructure, mobility, water, and waste, and their interactions. And the next slide actually says why these sectors are really important. This is from a paper we had in Science a little while back. But basically, if you look, or if you could point, Greg, it says that the red is energy systems right at the bottom in the key. If you go back one, we don't need the blue is municipal water supply and sanitation, the pink is mobility, the green is food systems, and the gray is really construction materials and green infrastructure. We just combine them together. And what you're seeing is on the very left side that these 7 sectors together contribute to about 86% of GHGs globally. It's much higher. We have a new version of this in our new paper. Currently, those 7 sectors contribute 96% of GHG emissions. They contribute 96% of water withdrawals, and they contribute about 19 million premature deaths, which are occurring. Again, if you look at the red, it's air pollution is coming from energy system, accidents and reduced mobility, sedentary lifestyle is related to the mobility system. The green is showing the premature mortality because of childhood underweight, poor diets, and the last is the impact of disasters. We have a new version of this, but the scale is about the same. You see more in terms of disasters. That was 2010 data. You see much more impact now. But our point is, if you zoom in on these 7 sectors, you could really address environment on one hand, but also health and climate-related disasters on the other hand. And so that's the anchor, that we don't do just one of them, we really need them all together.
So question, is this chart for all, like, average across cities in the world, or I guess, how does it vary?
Exactly. So if you hit the next click, this is global. So this is global, total global. And this is the challenge, how do you bring this down to the city scale? And this is what I'm going to talk about next, So urban infrastructure is a big piece of this, but then it's so variable. Your supply chains are transboundary, and I'll come to it in a second.
Okay.
But this motivates the 7-sector approach. And then the next slide looks at the multiple outcomes. So those 7 sectors affect well-being. We'll define it. Subjective well-being, they affect physical health, environmental impacts, social equity, as well as livability and their trade-offs. So that's why we call the Urban Nexus Lab, because we're looking at multiple sectors, multiple outcomes. And the next slide shows the multiple pathways. So we could look at urban design, which is spatial reconfiguration. We could look at different supply chains. We could look at technologies, new technologies, behavior change, and how do we integrate them. So many of our models integrate multiple of these strategies for making change happen. And so I'm now going to move into the second part of the talk, which is, we are focusing on developing science. It got a little cut off, but we're focusing on, in our grants, on India, China, and US over the past 8 or 9 years, and we're keen now to expand it globally, which would be another area to think about, particularly thinking about African urbanization. So if you go forward, I'm now moving to the second part of the talk, which I'm going to draw upon from this framework paper for connecting decarbonization with health, resilience, and equity. Again, it'll be out, I believe, in a month or two online. It's already forthcoming. So what we did here is, if you hit a return, so I want to acknowledge all my co-authors who are part of this paper. Then you hit another return. The big idea here is that globally we understand these 7 sectors, but when it comes to cities, cities only occupy 3% of the urban land area, but their impact is very much transboundary. So for example, our water system, urban water requirements of the 40 biggest cities are really impacting 40 of the world's biggest watersheds. So the impact when you bring food, when you bring water, when you bring energy, when you bring construction materials is no longer confined within the city boundary. And so the idea here is that we have to shift our framing from thinking about a boundary limited city to think about where everything is coming from and how you can reshape those supply chains by reshaping the design or technologies in your city. So that's what's illustrated in the next slide, which is this idea of going from cities, which you see on the very left. If you want to point, most of us, when we think of urban, we would be looking, even in those sectors, we would be looking within a city. And all of my research group is saying, where are those things coming from? Where are construction materials coming from? Where is the energy coming from? How do you systematically connect cities with these transboundary flows or transboundary supply chains? And these transboundary supply chains shape our GHG footprints, they shape our water footprints. They also address things like inequality, rural-urban, intra-urban. And so we built upon our previous paper in Science in 2016 to create a broader framework, which is now coming out in our new paper, which is next. And so this is the same idea. You recognize it's the same picture, but we're growing beyond greenhouse gas emissions. If you go up top, we're looking at these multi-scale air pollution and GHG footprints, which really allow us to think of cities connected broadly. If you look below, we can look at in and transboundary inequality. We can look at the blue boxes are showing health effects at multiple scales. You can look at indoor air pollution, unhealthy diets at the very left, at the household scale. You can look at poor access to greenery, nutritious food, walkable streets. So these are all things you can do within the boundary. But then you start looking at things like urban heat, flooding, and it's no longer within a city. The interactions that shape urban heat are very much urban regional. Both the climate system and the infrastructure system interact with each other at multiple scales that are actually quite complex. And it's sort of the frontier in climate risk modeling. You have regional air pollution, flooding, and drought, and all of that sits under these nested climate models. Similarly, you could think of institutions, right? So who's going to manage these risks? And so that's this question of how do you govern them because they're transboundary. And so increasingly, we're working with, with urban regional government. We think that's a very interesting scale to look at these multiple interactions. So that's the framing for how we look at all these connections. So if you
So
move
how
to
do
the
you-
next slide.
So question, how do you quantify a bunch of these? I mean, I guess in isolation, every one of these is quantifiable, but like most economic and econometric measurement is when everything else is held constant, whatever.
Right.
Emphatically, nothing is held constant in this kind of interconnected model. So how do you even characterize it?
So I'm going to show a few examples, and then we can talk more about this. So if you hit that's exactly what I'm doing now. So before we go there, I want to just define the terms. We could look at. So let me come back to your question in a bit. But this is what I was going to share here. A few examples where we're doing 2 or 3 of these outcomes. Probably not all of them, but at least 2 or 3 of them. So I'm going to talk about a zero carbon city in a little bit, but I want to just set the stage for health and well-being. So for health, you can look at metrics for physical health, because for modeling, you want to know what your metrics are. And most of that work in our models comes from the global burden of disease models. So we use their models downscale to the city scale. For subjective well-being, we actually have run surveys. So we do surveys in cities that measure both evaluative. My group focuses on evaluative or cognitive aspects of well-being. And then there's also emotional well-being. So you can start to see correlations. And so this is where the question is, you can't do everything in all of its complexity for the reasons you just mentioned. But the surveys actually help you understand which sectors. It's a data-driven approach to say which sectors in that particular city are of concern from a well-being perspective. Then you can zoom in on that sector for a well-being, to understand how it impacts well-being. In terms of inequality, we have some, again, data looking at how do you understand inequality at fine spatial scales, but also that it's not only about distributional inequality and equity. We're also interested in procedural equity and recognition equity, recognizing sort of the constraints and the historical institutional constraints that have prevented us from achieving the distributional equity. And again, involves surveys, involves engaged research with communities. So you just can't only do it through modeling. It just has to be this co-production, co-produced modeling. For resilience, our review paper showed that there is very little in terms of actually measuring resilience. There's complexity in how you measure it. There are complexity in definitions. And I think for today's talk, I'll probably step away from that because there's just so much going on. So if you move forward, I wanted to just first begin with the zero carbon pathways, that we don't even know what a zero carbon city is, because so many people have been defining a zero carbon city in different ways. So 2 years back, if you hit a return, we had this opinion piece or a perspective piece in Nature Sustainability saying, there is so much uncertainty on how to measure emissions, what emissions to measure. Can we come together on this? And so the idea here was to say that if we anchor our accounting approach on those key provisioning systems that I just described, you can not only think of zero carbon transitions that are sort of consistent across scale with national zero carbon models, but you can also advance these other outcomes that we've already talked about, health and equity and so on. So if you move forward, I just wanted to say that the outcome of this paper was to say a net zero carbon city is one that has net zero carbon transboundary infrastructure and food systems, because there's so much variation. So many cities might, if you want to point, might only look at energy, which is the lightning icon, and mobility. That's what most cities do. They would look at energy supply for buildings and mobility and say, well, if I decarbonize this, I have a zero carbon city. But then you miss interactions, you miss the construction materials. The construction materials can be changed by urban code. About 30% of global emissions are actually coming from some of these construction sectors. You miss the interaction with trees, which can sequester carbon. So you miss the interaction between circular economy. And so what we're saying is if we define these net zero carbon city as one with zero carbon transboundary life cycle based provisioning systems, then remember the first graph I showed, these sectors we know contribute about 95%. You're now aligning with national goals and global goals. So if you go forward, that's the case we make in this paper. There are 7 reasons to strategically focus on these systems, that globally they contribute about 90% of GHGs. They're the foundation for urban planning around net zero, electric mobility, nature-based solutions, smart city ideas, city actions to reduce demand. And I think this is where the national and global goals don't really address how cities can reshape and radically reduce demand. For example, again, mass timber construction is a great example. It can reduce cement use by about 80% on a building per square foot basis, which is substantial. So those are the types of systemic changes that cities can engage in. Circularity, circular economy can reduce the amount of virgin materials required, and that these 7 sectors foundationally impact inequality in access and consumption. They link to health and well-being. They link to other natural resources if you take a transboundary approach. And fundamentally, when these pillar sectors become net zero, we spend so much time looking at all the sectors in a city, which is very difficult to do. But what my argument here is, when these 7 sectors get close to net zero, the trade of embodied carbon in, for example, financial services is going to become almost zero. So we don't need to get into these very complicated, trade models for all these other sectors. Just focus on the 7. So that's the message of this paper, focusing on the 7, not worrying about all the other sectors and how trade affects them, because when you decarbonize these, the idea is that you'll decarbonize all those other embodied emissions, almost all.
Let me clarify this. So what are these other sectors? Because this is pretty comprehensive, but it sounds like what you're saying is that if you decarbonize these, everything else will follow because it has to. Is that fair? Or are you saying there's other things that are
so if you do input-output economic models, which is what a lot of people do, there are 520 sectors of the US economy. And so, sorry?
How big is one sector?
Well, so apparel manufacturing could be one.
Okay, so this is like a NAICS code.
Hospitals could be another one, educational institutions. And what I'm saying is each one of them, your educational institution, if you actually decarbonize these provisioning systems, its emissions are going to become virtually nearly zero. When you look at, because people are now really trying to say every industry should look at its supply chain emissions. And here we're saying, from a transition perspective, focus on these 7 sectors, because then all those other things will automatically get to zero.
Okay.
And that's something, so for now, right now, when people do a full input, quote unquote full, there's all of this argument. In fact, those are my next few slides. When you do this full accounting of trade in and out of cities, that's when these things are big infrastructure sectors. But your trade is happening for all these other things: educational services, recreational services, financial services, manufacturing. There are 500 sectors in the economy. And in fact, so a lot of times people get stuck in carbon accounting because that complexity is so incredible. And in this paper, we're saying, just please simplify it to 7 sectors. So here are those accounting approaches. One is purely territorial, which you may be familiar with. You just look at scope 1 emissions, and if you click a return, it's good. Don't do all of them. We'll go one by one. If you just do a territorial one, you'll only measure location-specific sources. You may see a power plant, but it doesn't tell you who's using the electricity. So it doesn't really inform the demand side. So the second approach is the 7-sector approach. You look at those 7 sectors from both a demand and a supply side. So where are they coming from? Where are they being used? So you can look at the full spectrum of innovations. Then there's consumption-based carbon accounting. So the community-wide infrastructure footprinting also includes scope 1, 2, and 3. Many people have confusions about this. The consumption-based approach is really focusing on household consumption of all those 500 sectors of the economy beyond the 7 sectors. And people think, oh, it must be more comprehensive. But it actually neglects the businesses that are in your boundary that are exporting, because you're only looking from a consumption perspective. And then the total community-wide footprint, if you hit a return, looks at all imports and exports in and out. It's incredibly complex. And there's a notion that that last one is indeed the most comprehensive. And our argument is, it may be if you were ever to be able to get that data for all cities at scale, but it's not even useful from a policy framework, which I show in the next slide, that each of these 4 approaches are suited to visions of a zero carbon city. So if you took a purely territorial approach, your vision for a zero carbon city is a zero carbon piece of land. City is sort of more than that. If you look at a community-wide infrastructure supply chain footprinting, if you hit a click, then your vision is net zero carbon provisioning systems. A zero carbon city, which is what I shared with you, is one that has zero carbon provisioning systems. If you took a consumption-based approach, a net zero carbon city is equivalent to net zero carbon household purchases beyond the things we already covered, water, energy, construction materials. So this would be, your clothing, furniture, all those other things. And then the last one is decarbonizing trade across cities beyond the key provisioning systems. And what we're saying is that trade will automatically decarbonize when you do the second approach. So that's just laying out the rationale for zooming in on those 7 sectors and seeing it as a vehicle for really decarbonizing the whole economy, which it does.
So let me keep this. There's 2 ways of approaching decarbonization. One is, I think what you're focusing on is the government policymaker kind of view, where they say, like, what do we prioritize our accounting and efforts? The other one is corporate. What's our sin against the environment and what do we do about it? That's my company. And it seems like this is not the, my company kind of view is not the focus here, but how would these views interact? Like, voluntary actions or cap and trade? There's also a corporate level view.
Sure. So this is a great question, because I think even for companies, I think it's really worth saying, so if you're not a company, so first of all, if you're a company in those 7 sectors, that's incredible, and this is what's happening. We focus on the energy companies, the oil companies, the power plant companies, because literally that is what is going to drive everything. So for the other companies that are not in that sphere of those 7 sectors, I think they too should prioritize those 7 sectors. So if for example, Alphabet or Google really said, I want to get these sectors to be decarbonized across all of my operations, I think that would provide the demand pull for those sectors to change. But I think where we get distracted is saying, well, I want to then look at all my other scope 3 emissions, which we spend a lot of time. And my opinion is you're probably going to drive the change faster if even a big company that's not in those sectors looked at their supply chain for those 7 sectors. Does that make sense? Because and so then you're not worried about, well, what am I doing with, I don't know, paper or something else, a better supply chain for hand sanitizer. I'm sure it's important, but I think driving these 7 truly has the impact.
Well, let's actually talk about some things that don't look like it, and let's see if it captures us. So you gave mass timber as an example. Ultimately, that comes from forests rather far away from the city. And similarly, biofuels used in the city came from probably some corn husk leavings on a farm very far away.
Right.
So is the argument that if you focus on converting to biofuels, it'll impact all those upstream things anyhow?
And that your models should take care of that. So when and I'm going to show you that when we do greenhouse gas footprinting, we're not just looking at the change you're making within the boundary. You're looking at, the pictures I showed you showed the supply chain, and that, but you focus on the supply chain for these 7 sectors, not the supply chain for everything else, like carpets or all the other things that are coming in and out, because these 7 sectors truly drive everything.
Okay, makes sense.
That's what I'm saying. Because, as a company, you have other purchases too, but these 7 really drive the world.
Okay.
So it's true that if construction materials are big, capital investments in construction are big things, then you should look at your construction materials, where they're coming from, what kind of designs, circularity solutions, reuse, recycling. I mean, the solution space is big, but what I'm saying here is zoom in on those sectors. They're not very many, and the impact of those is really outsized. Instead of spending money on tracking trade of something relatively minor like furniture, I'm not focusing on furniture, but I'm just saying sitting on one, and it's more important to really look at the energy coming into your system.
Got it. Okay.
All right. So if you keep going, those are great questions. So that's what I'm going to zoom in on. I've done a lot of more than 15 years of research developing these transboundary footprints. And you're exactly right. You have to look at the supply chains, where they're coming from. And what is more interesting, if you hit a return, is I started this work with Denver, and it started to inform Denver's climate action plan. And then this scope 1 + 2 + 3 approach, focusing on the 7 sectors, got institutionalized, if you hit another click, into ICLEI's US Community Protocol. Right now it's optional, and we're trying hard to tell all cities and all companies and anyone to really keep the focus on these. So for example, cities right now don't include construction materials. They don't have to, it's an optional. We're trying to make that optional sort of highly recommended. And so if you look at the next slide, you see some pictures of these footprints. This is Denver. If you go to the first one is Denver, you can see about half of the footprint is in blue, is all buildings energy, right? So then you can see the hatched portions. The hatched portions is imported electricity coming into the city. The orange is, if you want to point, all those orange colors are mobility-related emissions, so cars, trucks, SUVs. The solid colors are direct emissions, but then air travel is transboundary. Fuel processing is coming from outside. What you mentioned, your refineries are outside. Cement, even though you're constructing within your city, your cement is produced outside. Food is almost always, we can't produce at scale yet. It's produced outside. So you sort of get a sense that about 2/3 of your full infrastructure footprints are actually outside your city boundary, but you can shape them through demand, through supply chain, through design, through a number of strategies. We've done this in many cities. So people said, oh, you can't do this in other countries. And we showed that it can be done. Our next one is in Delhi. And you can very quickly see how much bigger cement is in Delhi, because it's a new city, it's being constructed. You could see airline travel is much smaller. You can start. So every city, it's like a fingerprint. Once you do this, cities recognize themselves. You even have higher waste emissions in Delhi than you have in Denver. So you can quickly start to see differences in how these emissions are driving, how these sectors are driving emissions. And you keep going. And so I thought there might be interesting collaboration opportunities. We can come back to this, but our interest is in scaling this. How can we scale this to multiple cities? Looking at urban form, construction materials. Obviously, there are some linkages with the Environmental Insight Explorer team, but there are other potentials we could talk about later. So I want to move into the next part of the talk, which is how much do uniquely urban processes contribute to national zero carbon pathways. So this is our paper in review. So I really would like not to, we wouldn't post this presentation. Hopefully, this is the second round of review. So fingers crossed, we're submitting a revision soon. But our point here is that there are uniquely urban strategies which national models are not capturing right now. And that these strategies, and I'll describe them, can contribute a lot. And if you hit a return, we first of all set up a pathways model. This is in collaboration, adapted from Cito et al. We're looking at for example, enhancing carbon stocks through trees, timber buildings, and soils. And this, like I said, this was adapted from a article that's out in 2021 in ARER with Karen Cito and several colleagues. And so what we did was we developed a quantitative model to model all of these pathways. So spatial planning comes in, single sector efficiency, lifestyle changes, local resource circularity through food, energy, water, waste sectors connected with district energy systems as an example. Then after that only do you look at supply, because you really want to, the benefit of cities is to reduce demand. Supply side options become expensive. We decarbonize the power sector, electrify heating and mobility, look at renewable enabled carbon valorization, and then we enhance carbon stocks. And so what we're doing now is applying this in a quantitative way in cities to develop a pathway model to net zero. If you keep going. We did a lit review. I don't expect you to read at length in this, but this lit review shows there are actually very few multi-sector models. So when we looked at all the literature specifying net zero or zero carbon or zero emissions, 705 out of 2,000 or so papers, 700 were all conceptual. Another bunch was on governance. And then a lot of emphasis on buildings only models, buildings and energy, mobility models, a little more on water, wastewater, some single sector models. Then there were a few two sector models, buildings and mobility, buildings, energy and mobility, buildings, energy and wastewater, as you can see. But there were very, very few community-wide multi-sector, 7-sector models, all the 7 sectors. So that's what our paper is about. And you keep going.
Actually, can you give examples of what models are like good foundations for this comprehensive model, or there are such comprehensive models?
What foundations?
Yeah, which models are either usable today or foundations for the complete model?
Oh, so I think you have building blocks. Our argument is that there are none doing the 7-sector models. So a good foundation is urban metabolism, because urban metabolism models consider the 7 sectors, but they often don't consider their interactions or their land use linkages. So they may not connect to. So to give you the short answer is the urban metabolism literature would give you the foundation, but it lacks some key things that we added in our paper. So if you go next, what we did was that's what we did. We focused on land use, which very few of these urban metabolism models do. And we looked at how can you integrate all these 7 sectors. So again, this is what is in review. Then we built up the technology layer over the land use layer. And then we included the interaction with circularity. So typically you don't find all of them in a single model. So either the circularity isn't there, or the land use isn't there, or the interactions isn't there. And you also need the supply chain at the bottom. You need to know where your supply chains are coming from. So from our view, there is nothing that does all of these, and that's the framework we're proposing in this paper. And then the storyline is fairly short if you keep going. is that with this model, this requires a new modeling approach. We found that these urban strategies are significant. National models don't quantify them. Urban models don't even quantify them because we don't cover these interactions. But when you actually look at them together, the sum is greater than the parts, right? And so that's what we're finding. So it's not some, I wish, I had hoped that we would be able to have this to share, but hopefully in the next few months. But so when you say what is the kind of modeling that I'm doing, it's very much within the city, land use linked urban metabolism model, but with the circularity, intersection, and transboundary supply chains. And that's what I don't think we haven't seen very many more. So that's sort of what my group is doing.
So yeah, but this is obviously inherently difficult. So just to understand where on the where your models lie, I guess should we be thinking of it? Is it more like an accounting kind of model where you go with these?
So this is a good question you're asking. It isn't that it again depends on your question. So if the question is decarbonization and you don't need temporal detail, it's actually not that difficult because you're looking at aggregate flows of construction. But if your question is resilience, if your question is heat stress or, the operation of my power grid, so that's where I think you want to start from here. In my mind, you need a slew of models of varying complexity to look at how much spatial granularity do you need. Now, for equity, you do. But if you're not doing equitable design, maybe you don't. For climate impacts, you need granularity to look at, hurricane, power outages. You need granularity because you're talking about the power system design, power outages. So that becomes more complicated. But I don't think every sector needs to be fully complicated in its full glory. I think you really want to match your model complexity with the questions that are being asked. And
okay, yeah. And what I'm thinking is models like GCAM or
yes,
like integrated assessment models, which are global. They're not quite the same shape.
Right now, they are not reflecting any of this, and that is where we are pushing the envelope. So GCAM is, in fact, this is something we've been discussing. GCAM, GTEP, any of these big environment economy models are not capturing these urban scale approaches, particularly so they would capture it in a loose way by saying, oh, you cut demand by X%,
Yeah.
But then they don't tell you how you're actually going to cut the demand. And then these bottom-up models could actually give you that reflection. And so at some point, you want to look at merging these with those, which is absolutely what our lab is looking at doing. How do you, at what scale of aggregation, this is an open question.
And now, like going from the other side, let's say urban sim doesn't do this integrated carbon flows, but it is that granularity, has many of these subsystems coupled together and is dynamic. So how is that as a foundation?
Sorry? It has many of these sectors. Yeah.
It has some of these sectors, has many of the dynamic interactions, but certainly it's not designed as an integrated urban assessment model. It's designed for city planning, but it has some of the right shape of what you're describing. How's that as a foundation?
Yeah. So I think there is intersection, but they're not going, there are some fundamental, so the scale of some of these things, these larger macro energy system models are not operating at a scale where they could even include some of these processes. I think that's where we want to go next.
Okay. Yeah. And then, so it sounds like an adequate, one possible approach is, expanding an urban sim to account for more of these things. And I guess having direct connections to a global model to these local urban models. Yeah. But then let me ask you this question. Because every city is semi-unique, how much data you need for something like this?
That's my last topic, the scaling up question. We're talking about going in the same. I'm listening to your questions, and they're exactly the questions we're asking.
Okay, well, then let's keep going. That's awesome.
So I'm moving on a little bit from net zero to looking at these intersections, right? So how do we do these intersections with health? And I'm not suggesting I have the modeling solution. Some of my models are older. There is a 2017 paper, but I also just want to give you a flavor. And also, if I'm talking too long, you can just tell me to stop, because it's 1:15 already. So I just want to give you a flavor of this nexus, right? How do you explore the nexus? So this is just with the health and well-being, maybe a little bit of equity. So if you keep going, so I showed you this. This is how I see it happening. This is what needs to happen. And then how are we actually operationalizing this? The next slide shows us zero carbon and health linkages. This is our paper from 2017 in Nature Climate Change, where again, we looked at all cities. So you were talking about scale, right? So how do you scale it? So here we looked at 637 Chinese cities. If you keep going, we had, actually, if you go to the next one, if you go to the next, okay, this, I wanted to show you this before. So what we did was we divided up China into its multiple grid regions. So I think it has 6 or 7 grid regions. Within each of them, we had the different cities. So we had cities and provinces. We had provinces within the grid. Can you see the embeddedness? Provinces are within the grid region, and then the grid regions are within the country. And then we looked at what you can do within the city boundary in terms of these very interesting material exchanges. So symbiotic exchanges with district energy, waste heat, material exchanges between power plants. And then we literally scaled it up to look at national impact. And alongside this model, we also had an air pollution model that looked at air pollution at the provincial scale with my colleague Ted Russell at Georgia Tech. And then if you go to the next slide, actually the next slide would be helpful. If you keep going, we looked at how much these cross-sector, remember the cross-sector integration is what many people weren't modeling. We found that those cross-sector strategies, everything that's in orange. So first of all, if you just looked at single sector, you see power plant, steel, cement. China has these national targets. That's the blue bar. If you look at the dark blues industry, the light blues power plants, it so happens about 2/3 of them are located within urban areas because they're just physically there. That's what is shown in the second blue bar. And they can generate waste heat, from these things that can be reused in district energy systems. That's what you're seeing in the orange bar. And so what we found is that there is enough waste heat from these big industries to use in district energy systems. There's a lot of fly ash, steel slag that you can use, and you would still have low-grade energy. We're not talking about high-grade, but low-grade heat for future urban growth. So there's so much potential in these industrial cities that are coming up, untapped potential to reduce energy use and material use. So we then input that in this national model. And if you go either to the previous or the next slide, so these, if you go to the previous slide, you can see the number of, deaths avoided. You could see which cities were the hotspots for avoided mortality. And really, I believe 60,000 premature deaths were avoidable each year just by those symbiotic strategies within cities. So just to give a sense of scale. So this is an example of how you would scale up. The next ones are all very small. We're doing research on well-being, which I mentioned is subjective well-being. So this is more to prioritize. We have those 7 sectors. Which of those sectors are truly important in shaping well-being as well as equity? I won't get into detail. We don't have time. I just wanted to share. For equity, to design for equity, we need much better fine-scale data. So if you go to the next slide, we have a paper in PNAS at unpacking income and race effects, looking at energy use. And the upshot of this is we looked at, if you look at the left side, we looked at 233 census block groups in St. Paul. And you're seeing almost like a separation. If you look the blue dots are the highest income groups, which happen to be the least non-white. And so they're actually majority white neighborhoods. If you look at the remaining colors as the, you're looking at mean household income. So as you look lower, can look at the quintiles. You can look at the red, which is the lowest 20% quintile. And the lowest 20% quintile has the lowest income, but also has a very large spread in terms of racial diversity. And so then we said, okay, our hypothesis here is there a race effect separate from income in terms of energy interventions? And so in our next slide, we looked at energy use intensity as a proxy. We looked at it as a proxy for energy efficiency. And actually, not the next slide, go back, the same figure, the next figure. Yeah, at the bottom, within each income level, you can see that the slopes are significant. So even within low income stratum, whether your community has, the percentage of non-white is still significant, statistically significant. So this is the kinds of data to demonstrate that there is a race effect beyond an income effect. You can actually measure it. You now have to go back to say what kind of interventions would allow you to provide energy efficiency investments in these areas. But the first step is even understanding what types of inequality are you grappling with. Okay, the next few slides are just smaller slides. Yeah.
Just clarify. So your analysis is this is energy use intensity or change in intensity based on interventions.
Yes, and so in the paper we also look at the funding. How much funding? I haven't shown this in this slide. We looked at how much does funding get allocated, and does it get allocated to the houses that have among the larger EUIs, because you would like to focus on them. And it turns out that it's not. So it allows you to develop more equitable allocation procedures based on the data.
Okay.
That's the gist of this paper. And I think I might stop. The next one is looking at designing policies at the intersection. So you can see I'm getting to more and more outcomes. This is the intersection of air pollution and zero carbon and health. And now we're looking at equity in policies. So again, we know the link between income and emissions is well known, but how do we use it in a metabolism framework to design policy? So this is on policy design. The other one was on spatial allocation of resources. So that's it. I think I'll stop there and say that our interest, of course, in the next slide is on scaling up. Exactly what you were asking is also what we're grappling with. And there are approaches we can talk more about, but I just wanted to close with that. We are trying various things. This may be a place to think about further conversations or collaborations. And I think that's about all I had. If you can go click.
Oh,
we do have a framework for doing this, which is, which I showed here. This is the framework in our nature sustainability, the 7 sectors, the different outcomes, and thinking about carbon on one hand and thinking about these additional outcomes on the other.
Great. So then what is, I guess the amount of data required to understand this stuff is enormous. And I guess I'm thinking both on measuring the current state and enough of past dynamics to know what pushes what. Mm-hmm. So what are good focal points? What analyses or measurements or sensors can enable, such models?
Right. I think, first of all, I wanted to say it's not entirely daunting. So in the sense, so our own group is looking at land use, land cover, and green infrastructure. And we think we're going quite far in being able to look at this at scale and monitor across different geographies. We're testing this in India. I think that we should focus on the things that we have data on. I think or simulations, because you may not have at scale data at every location, but do we have reasonable simulations? I think NREL has the residential and commercial stock models. There are reasonably good energy use models. We've actually developed a paper on 600 urban districts of India, where we used social surveys on expenditure. So again, if you're not interested in resilience, but you want the total energy use, I think there's the potential to go at scale just for aggregate annual or even seasonal energy use, but annual for sure. I think we're almost there. The challenges for me lie in areas like mobility, which are hard for researchers to get data at scale. But when I think of and construction materials, I see those two as places to focus on. Whereas I feel things like energy use, you can get consumption surveys, you can get other types of data, night lights data. I think there are opportunities there. I think in terms of fundamental gaps, I have to say construction materials probably the biggest one.
Yes. Mobility makes me think, like, if you look at some of the archives for the stock series, you have these transportation models. I'm thinking argons or sumo, which is very fine grained. But then,
and then I think after that, the question is, can we have a suite of sort of fit for purpose models rather than going for full complexity? To me, after that, the strategy would be to test use cases, to say, well, we don't want to begin with data, because then you don't progress, because it's so daunting. But you want, right, because if you say, well, we begin with data, you want everything for every sector at all time scales, just not possible. But I think if you flip the question and say, what are we answering here? To me, it may get you to the same place, but in a different way.
Yes. And it seems like a lot of construction materials, you have to partner with companies. I'm thinking some data sources very explicitly can tell you a lot about the wood supply chain, but only if you're one of the companies giving them data, because how they live, they need data, so they only give you good data if you give them data. So you have to partner with a company. So a lot of the stuff is not so much a city public policy problem or I guess public planning problem. It's a industrial decarbonization problem.
It could be, but I think understanding it's not really, because the city zoning laws and design laws shape the demand. So if you allow, so that's why I don't think it's entirely an industrial decarbonization problem. But I think you could also get data through, there are bottom-up approaches where you can think of engineering design. There are some nice, which I think they're in the experimental stage, but you could potentially use all the data you have from the street view to get an idea. We've actually done waste volume estimation with one of these LiDAR cameras, because you have a lot of unburnt waste piles in Indian cities. There's no way to quantify how much there is by any other way. But we've actually gone and done some physical measurements along with the LiDAR camera to look at, to do volume estimations. I think there's some really neat potential ideas to look at the demand side from a city perspective.
That's true. And so the unburnt waste is a problem because you don't know what's inside. But yeah, LiDAR, if you have drones flying up and down, that should work. Also, missions like eddy covariance is usually it's hours, but you can't put them on drones these days, and you can't sweep cities for feel it breathing. But it's not going material flow; it's the airflow.
That's right.
Material flow is always difficult, and for that, I mean, there are always these startups coming up that are putting sensors everywhere and tracking flow. Usually, it's in corporate value chains. They're for secrecy reasons not exposed. That's going to be a government role in forcing people to expose some of these measurements.
So right now, I have 2 PhD students, and we're hoping to do a collaboration with computer science, and maybe I'm open to other ideas, just really zooming in on those construction materials, because they're much larger. The impact on GHG is much larger than people know. There are estimates that it could be in excess of 20-25% globally. And we don't know that sitting in the US because we're not constructing as much as other parts of the world are. And that's where I think it could be super impactful.
So we're almost out of time, but let me ask you one more question, because a lot of construction is going to be Africa, India, China, and the municipalities there care to various extents that vary significantly by local political climate. What would be your approach for engaging with all these policymakers?
So I just said I direct the Center for Global India. This is very much what we want to do. So we have engaged already with 3 municipalities, with 3 regions where we want to do some of this bottom-up approach. At the same time, I think, it's interesting. It's not always true that there is less data. So many years back, there used to be a cement map of India, which actually produced cement demand at different geographies. So I think it's more connecting the dots, how do these different sectors use cement or concrete? And so again, it's that multi-scale modeling from the building to neighborhood to this aggregate scale. But I think with AI, machine learning, and computer vision, there could be some new opportunities here.
No, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. But then, well, thank you. This is fascinating and extremely valuable.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you for having me, and happy to follow up at some future time.
Absolutely.
My last slide has some contact. If anyone wanted to connect, you can share that. Thanks.
Thank you.